I'd like to acknowledge the support of the Department of Labor and Advanced Education, who has not only provided the necessary funding for the Community Sector Council, but individually have provided invaluable assistance at every step of the way, and always done in a respectful and helpful manner. And it's my pleasure to introduce Anne Perigo, Manager of the Voluntary and Nonprofit Sector Division for the Department of Labor and Advanced Education. Anne.
Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to say welcome. And I'm very impressed with the turnout at 198. Because as Andrea and I were driving in from Truro this morning, we said, gee, every time we organize something, we get maybe like 95 or maybe 100. But we always had room for more. So this is wonderful to see almost 200 people gathered. I think the next 2 days are going to be amazing. The agenda has been thoughtfully put together, and some wonderful speakers are going to be here with you folks. So I just wanted to congratulate the Community Sector Council, a year and a half old, the board members and all of the staff and the regional staff, which was kind of a huge accomplishment, I think. So welcome, enjoy, and meet everybody in the room. All right, thanks very much.
Thank you, Anne. So this morning we're going to start with our keynote speaker, and I'm going to ask Susan Barthos to come and introduce the keynote speaker. Susan.
It was a great pleasure to be asked to introduce our keynote speaker, Anne Makhoul. Anne has a Bachelor of Science from the University of Western Ontario and a Master's of Education from St. Paul University in Ottawa. In her very full career, she's been a freelance writer, researcher, and educator. Anne joined the Caledon Institute of Social Policy in 2000 and is currently their principal project officer. She has co-authored several Caledon reports and is the lead writer and coordinator of the Community Stories series, accounts of social policy in action which highlight innovative community initiatives. She has written extensively in support of Vibrant Communities, which is the Pan-Canadian Community Revitalization and Poverty Reduction Initiative, which Caledon helped found in 2002. Liz Weaver, Vice President of Tamarack, which co-sponsored the Vibrant Communities campaign, credits Anne with being, and I quote, "the best writer of community stories that I have ever met." On a personal front, Anne is a serial organizer. She's organized her soccer team, a local neighborhood watch, and a theater goers group. She's currently in recovery, as she puts it, from school council duties now that her sons are in their 20s. She skis, hikes, belongs to a gardening group that raises produce for a nonprofit organization that serves Ottawa's homeless. And furthermore, she's recently taken up classical guitar, probably because she found herself with, time on her hands. Now, just think about all of this for a moment and see if it sounds familiar to you. Anne is an individual who holds down a full-time job in the field of social justice while juggling numerous volunteer commitments and doing her very best to take care of herself, her family, and her community. So what does this make Anne? It makes her one of us. Please help me extend a very warm maritime welcome to our keynote speaker, Anne Makhoul.
So good morning, and thank you for that lovely introduction and welcome. It's a real pleasure to be here with you this morning. Today, the weather's not so hot, but this campus is gorgeous. I just took a walk around, and it's a delight to be here. Just to give a quick introduction to what I'm going to say today, I'm talking about the social impact of the nonprofit sector, the power of one. I'll be speaking to you for probably about 45 to 50 minutes, and there'll be some time for questions, I hope, at the end. I'm sorry about these screens. It makes it difficult for some people to see. If anybody wants to take a second and adjust seats, that's fine by me. And as well, the paper that I've presented today, or I'm presenting today, will be available to you on the Caledon and I'm sure the Council Sector website at some point. So feel free to read it. All of the people I'll mention, the websites, reports will be all there, so you don't have to scribble unless you really feel like it. So, when I got the call from Kathleen and the invitation to come to speak to you today, it couldn't be more fitting for me on a personal level because I actually have family history in this college. In 2006, the Nova Scotia government created this college by blending together 13 campuses, 6 learning centers into one institution. But it wasn't just an act of government that created this college. It was the result of the hopes and dreams and ideas of many people who began with one idea, one course, grew into a program, and here we are today. And my grandfather, Major James Church, was one of those early dreamers. During the Second World War, he trained soldiers to be surveyors overseas. And when the war ended, he convinced the government that Canada needed surveyors and that these young demobilized soldiers were now going to need some job skills. So he hammered away at government until the college could stand on its own 2 feet and attract new students and graduate people with marketable skills. So my grandfather wouldn't have known the term social impact, but that's what he had. That's what he achieved. He took his skills, he took their needs, and brought a new thing into being. If you ever visit Lawrencetown, Annapolis County, you'll see the Land Survey Institute still there, though today it's called the Center for Geographical Sciences, and it's considered a world leader in geomatics. And if you look inside that building, you'll see my grandfather's original surveying instruments carefully preserved behind glass. But just as his brass and glass levels have been digitized and software has replaced the slide rule, the tools that my grandfather used and the tools that the nonprofit sector uses to achieve its outcomes continues to evolve and change. We still have to hammer for funding. But we also now more currently use partnership and collaboration to create our impact, to deepen our impact. And so I'm going to talk to you a bit today about social impact. Like this college, your new sector council was also achieved by hammering away at people until the sector could gain the respect and the support that it needs to do the work that all of you do. So I consider that a congratulations to everyone in this room that was involved in that. This is a really exciting time to be involved in the nonprofit sector. Aside from the funding issues, there are new ways to work together, new ways to get the funding in place, and new ways to accelerate our learning by looking at what other people are doing. But it's also, as I said, challenging for the funding question. It's always the question. And some nonprofits aren't making it through. We know that. So as economies shift and our demographics change and our environment seems to be changing, there are a lot of challenges all of us face and a lot of questions that we all have. So today I'm going to be contemplating with you 3 questions. I don't come with answers to them. I come with questions, and I'm hoping that they will help to seed some conversations for you over the next couple of days, over the next few years. Because as we work through this time that we're in, it's going to be a question of how we manage change. So I'm looking at 3 questions today. First, what is social impact and how is it measured? Second, how do nonprofit organizations either create or deepen their impact? And my third question is to do with how do you as Nova Scotians in this now or never moment use the stories and the ideas that I'm going to be bringing you this morning. So to start, you've been seeing as you came in, there were some figures up about how many nonprofits there are in Nova Scotia. By a website that I checked, there are about 5,280 of you. Across Atlantic Canada, there are 13,000. And those 13,000 pull in $4 billion a year in revenue and employ 83,000 people. Now, the Ontario Nonprofit Network, and I'm sorry if you can't see the numbers at the back, but I'll go through these in a second, created this infographic to sort of give a sense of the size of the sector relative to others in Canada. And as you can see, that bottom line is the biggest, and that is nonprofits as a whole. And they contribute, in 2006 at least, they contributed $101 billion to Canada's economy. Second one up is mining, oil, and gas, and that's at about $86 billion. Then we have retail at $75 billion. And then we have what we call core nonprofit, which is all the nonprofits, but we take out colleges like this one, universities, and hospitals. And it's still pretty big at almost $36 billion a year. Slightly behind is accommodations and food service, agriculture, and the motor vehicle manufacturing sector. So I don't know about you, but I think those are pretty impressive numbers. That's a pretty big sector. However, my next slide also talks about revenue sources. And these are Ontario figures, but I imagine they're pretty similar here in Nova Scotia, where the biggest chunk of money comes from government at 45%, earned income 36%, gifts and donations 15%, and other income 4%. And as I said earlier, we all know that money is the big issue, so we have to think about that. But social impact is, as we know, not just about money. It's about trying to find a measure across the sector for demonstrating value to ourselves, to our people that we work with and for, to government, to business. Because the sector is beginning to have a better sense of who it is and needs to communicate that better. So we're looking for metrics, we're looking for ways to demonstrate value. And this is a really data-hungry period. We know that there are certain data sources that have been either eliminated or in jeopardy, things like the long-form census. So we are looking at ways to put numbers down to demonstrate value of the work. So how do we do that? So that's my first question. What is social impact and how is it measured? But one thing I would just want to mention before I get going. The Caledon Institute of Social Policy in Ottawa is a national-oriented think tank. It's funded by the Maitrey Foundation in Toronto, and it's fueled by the passion of three people principally, Ken Battle, Sherry Torgman, and Michael Mendelson. And for nearly 22 years, Caledon has been trying to encourage governments at the municipal, provincial, territorial, and federal level to adopt sustainable social policy that allows every Canadian to live a full and rich life. Caledon's main areas of influence are income security, disability, caregiving, poverty reduction, Aboriginal education. And those are all issues that are national in scope. So as you've heard, I'm a storyteller, so my stories are going to reflect that kind of national character. They're not all from Nova Scotia, but my last story is, so you can see I've saved the best for last. Okay, so what is social impact? Well, simply put, it refers to the effect that your work has on the people that you're dealing with. But as I said, it's more than that. So how do we measure it? 2 years ago, Sherry Torgman and I were asked by the Alberta Community Human Services Network, a fancy way of saying nonprofit network, to take a look at benefits literature that existed in Canada and around the world. Benefits literature meaning any kind of evaluative literature that looked at the benefits, the social impact, and the economic impact of the nonprofit sector. And as we know, it's a huge sector. How do you break that down? So what we did was we selected 8 areas. We were starting out with 6. We actually had a list of 20, and we narrowed it down to these 8 because they were of interest to Caledon and of great interest to the Community Human Services Network in Alberta. So we looked at these 8, and if you sort of think about where you think maybe the best evaluative literature came from, I don't know if you'd have picked it out, but it was in early childhood education and in crime prevention. There was tons and tons of literature, as you can imagine, that we sifted through, but not a lot of it was evaluative. And the stuff that we found that was cost-benefit. And cost-benefit as a methodology for figuring out impact was very popular in the 60s and 70s. But the problem with it became that there were a number of problems. One, it requires expertise, it requires long-term patient funding, so you have to carry that over a long period of time, and it requires a large group of randomly selected subjects. So that's not an easy thing to accomplish, and it works okay if you got a straightforward intervention. But they've done studies now that demonstrate that even if you make minor tweaks to an intervention or you move it to a different locale, the outcomes are not necessarily as robust. You might have a great cost-benefit ratio, and then you move it somewhere else or try it somewhat differently, and things change. There was a big study down in the United Kingdom by PricewaterhouseCoopers where they looked at cost-benefit, and they demonstrated that even minor cost variances could change your cost-benefit ratios to 0 or less. So that wasn't working so well, especially as we got a little more involved with one another. As partnerships started to be built, it was harder to get the cost-to-benefit ratio to fit the work. For example, if I'm looking at caregiving and I'm a hospital and I offload my caregiving responsibilities to you at home, say taking care of an elderly parent, that's a benefit to me as a hospital, but it's certainly not a benefit to you as a consumer. It's a cost. So as we came to be more collaborative in our work, cost-benefit wasn't fitting. So there was a new kid on the block by the end of the 1970s, something called social return on investment. And it really tried to get to this idea of blended value. How do we show value in social, economic, and environmental terms? But it began to run into trouble too. It became extremely difficult to figure out attribution, and in particular, well, not in particular, there are about 8 questions that we still have with it that are very that still aren't answered. So social return on investment, even in the 80s, it became really cumbersome. It was hard to justify some of the conclusions it was coming to, so it began to lose popularity. But in the 2 years since Sherry and I did the research for the Community Human Services Network, social return on investment has come back again. It seems to be rebounding in popularity. And Sherry just wrote a paper called Social Return on Investment, Strengths and Challenges. And in it, she outlines some ongoing questions about the methodology. So, first, both cost-benefit and social return on investment cannot measure things like social inclusion to this date. They're not particularly good at capturing feelings and thoughts. Whose benefits are we striving to achieve when we do this kind of evaluation? And following on that is the success lens for the work created by the funding body. Does pressure for results end up creaming participants most likely to succeed? If you think about the work that you do, often it's the people who are having the most trouble that you most want to help. But in terms of evaluation and the need for the pressure for results, sometimes this problem happens, and we don't think that SROI at this point can answer that problem or that question. How does social return on investment manage the disconnect between what's funded and what occurs? Things happen as we're doing an intervention. We may need to change things as we go along, and SROI does not manage that at this time. And can SROI, social return on investment, account for what happens in the broader economic and social context? So with those questions in mind and those 2 methodologies, we don't as a sector have a common evaluation methodology or even orientation at this point. We may in the future. The Canadian Community Economic Development Network, or CEDNET, is promoting social return on investment as a methodology. In the United Kingdom, in fact, in 2012, they passed some legislation called the Public Services Social Value Act. And that explicitly encourages the public services to consider social value. So they've gone it out from a legislative perspective, and I don't know if Canada will follow suit. So in the meantime, if you think about how your own organization evaluates your work and its impact, it may be a fairly straightforward methodology, or it may be more complex depending on what kind of partnerships you have. So I'm going to give you an example of one organization that went through actually 3 iterations of evaluation. And it was mentioned by Susan in the introduction that Caledon was involved with something called Vibrant Communities. Can I just see a show of hands how many of you have heard of Vibrant Communities? Oh, great, a good number. I'm not sure if you know the origins of the project. In 2001, Sherry wrote a paper called Reclaiming Our Humanity. And it's kind of a foundational paper, and if you're a bit of a social policy wonk as I am, you might enjoy reading it, because it still stands the test of time. It talks about the fact that Canada can build socially responsible, inclusive, vibrant communities. And that paper generated a lot of interest and discussion, notably among Paul Bourne and Mark Cabage with the Tamarack Institute, which was newly created at that time, and the J.W. McConnell Family Foundation out of Montreal, Catherine Pearson, now deceased, and Tim Broadhead. All together, the three of those organizations got together and decided that they needed to take a crack at learning about poverty. They didn't know how to solve the problem, but they wanted to do some serious work about reducing poverty, creating more enlivened communities, and they wanted to do it across the country. So they went and they looked for 14 partners. Eventually, 14 partners signed on. And the way Vibrant Communities worked was this. We use this infographic as kind of a way to encapsulate the work. And so Vibrant Communities didn't say, this is how you do it. They said, here are the principles that we want you to follow. How you do it is up to you. So that circle in the middle, poverty reduction, may sound like common as grass today. But at the time that this project was getting off its feet, we talked about poverty alleviation, not poverty reduction. Multi-sectoral collaboration meant that we were going to work with business, government, nonprofits, and people with lived experience of poverty. Community learning and change meant that the process of change was important, not just the interventions. Community asset building, well, we used to sort of look at communities and say, what's wrong with the place, and let's fix it. Instead, the asset orientation said, what's good about the place, let's make it better. And last, comprehensive thinking and action was meant to have a focus on looking at things as they were unfolding, and that's exactly what happened. But it also meant that over time the evaluation modeling would change. Initially, the group started off looking at LICO, low-income cutoff measures, and said, okay, we're going to measure LICOs from the beginning to the end, and we'll look at employment, education, housing, financial investments, and benefits that people are collecting. But that was too long-term, and it was too much of a straitjacket for the 14 communities that were participating. So we came to us, actually, I advanced my slide a little, we sorry about that. Ignore that slide for a moment. We came to something called developmental evaluation. Michael Quinn Patton, if you've heard of his work, had done a lot of writing about that. And instead of just looking at LICO, which has to do with statistics, the communities involved were also going to write a theory of change, a story of how change would occur on the ground as they saw it. And they would come back and reflect on that theory at different points. The third methodology was to write community stories. So then what the communities had was a blend of quantitative and qualitative information that they could look at, and they could actually see how poverty reduction was happening on the ground. That worked from 2002 to 2006. But by 2006, the understanding of just how complex poverty is was really gaining hold, and they needed something better. So now my next graphic, and you've had a little time to look at that. Sustainable livelihoods asset areas were defined in the 1980s, and basically the theory behind them is that if you really want to get out of poverty, you have to build assets in these 5 different areas. It's not enough just to get a good job. It's not enough just to get a better house. You need to be continually building in order to continue your movement out of poverty. The other 3 levels of change that Vibrant Communities at that point was able to identify were there are 3 other things that can be going alongside. Maybe there are programmatic interventions going on in your community. Maybe, for example, you've got a new transportation model that works, or you've got good childcare. So there are programmatic things that can be done to help people in poverty that also need to be tracked. The second is there could be a systems change, something like a change in minimum wage or a change in the social assistance rates. So we need to account for that. And last, communities have various capacities to create change, to get at this business of poverty reduction. So at the end of 2008, there was now a third methodology in place where Vibrant Communities would look at 13 asset areas over these 3 levels of change. And that worked pretty well. So well, in fact, that at the end of the 10 years, this is what the numbers looked like. So across 14 cities, and I'm just going to round these numbers up to the thousands, we have roughly 440 100,000 poverty-reducing benefits going to 203,000 households in Canada. 256 poverty-reducing initiatives completed or in progress, $22.8 million invested, 2,278 organizations partnering, 1,500 individuals playing substantial roles, including 840 people who are living in poverty, and 53 substantive government policy changes. So that's, I think, pretty good. And it was attracting a lot of attention, this idea of working in the multi-sectoral fashion like this. And other communities became interested. So at the end of 2011, Caledon and Makhoul removed themselves. We went on to different work. But Tamarack wanted to continue with Vibrant Communities, and it's now called Vibrant Canada. In fact, there's a sort of a sub-name, Cities Reducing Poverty. And it's a bit of a misnomer because it's not just cities anymore. It's cities, rural communities, regions, all participating. The goal is to get 100 of them working and to affect poverty change in 1 million households. And that's what we call a stretch target. They're not there yet, but they're well on their way. Another thing that's happened in the last little while is a methodology that was popularized by 2 Americans. It's called collective impact. And it's another model for getting at this idea of poverty reduction. And it looks to me a lot like Vibrant Communities when you break it down. These are the things that it uses to make change. A common agenda, a shared measurement system, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, and a backbone or leadership organization. So all of this to say that there is no one methodology, there is no one way to assess the social impact of the work that you're doing. But there's a lot of interest in different ways of doing it. Perhaps we'll move to something more standardized. This is a point in my thinking about this talk where I kind of felt like, okay, that's enough of numbers, methodologies, tracking. Because for me, the work of this nonprofit sector and achieving social impact isn't just about facts and figures. In fact, I think sometimes it's really more about the emotional connection that we have to the work. So the next portion of my speech, I'm going to do some storytelling for you. And I'm going to tell you 4 stories. But the first thing I want to do before I do that is to show you a video that for me gets at this business of the emotional side of the work, the engagement side that's so vital to the work. One of my favorite, he's no longer with us, Oscar Wilde had a quote that I really, really liked, and he said, "A cynic is a person who knows the value of nothing and the cost of everything. And a sentimentalist knows the cost of nothing and the value of everything." So I tend to be a sentimentalist. I tend to value everything, and I know that it's important to do both sides of that. But I want you just to have a look at this, this video. The Roots of Empathy was dreamed up by an Ottawa teacher by the name of Mary Gordon in 1996. And Caledon wrote a community story about it in 1999, and I'll just show you this brief video to give you a sense of that program.